Africa is often called the cradle of humanity, the place where our species first stood upright, first made tools, first formed families, and first looked up at the sky and wondered about forces greater than themselves. But what fewer people know is that Africa may also be the birthplace of the world's earliest religious beliefs, traditions so ancient that they existed long before writing, agriculture, or civilization. Long before Egypt built its pyramids, long before Mesopotamia carved its clay tablets, long before any known prophet or scripture appeared, the first humans living in Africa were already practicing rituals that revealed a deep awareness of the spiritual world. This is the starting point of our story, a journey back not just thousands, but tens of thousands of years, to a time when our ancestors were discovering what it meant to be human. In recent decades, archaeology has uncovered remarkable evidence that spirituality in Africa stretches back at least 70,000 years, making it the oldest known religious tradition on Earth. These discoveries are not vague speculations, they are physical, tangible traces of belief carved into stone, painted onto cave walls, buried with the dead, and passed down through the living memory of African communities. Each discovery challenges the long-held assumption that early humans were merely focused on survival and lacked the capacity for ritual or symbolic thought. Instead, the evidence shows that the earliest Africans were thinkers, dreamers, and believers, people who saw the world as alive with unseen forces and spiritual power. When we talk about the origin of African traditional religion, we are not speaking about the beliefs of recent centuries or even the practices of well-known ethnic groups like the Yoruba, the Zulu, or the Ashanti. We are speaking about something far older, something that began before any modern ethnic identity existed. We are speaking about the roots of spirituality itself, buried deep in the prehistoric soil of the African continent. Sites like Blombo's Cave in South Africa, Border Cave along the border of South Africa and Eswatini, and the sacred Tsodilo Hills in Botswana, sometimes called the Mountain of the Gods, have revealed traces of ritual behavior so old that they completely rewrite our understanding of early humanity. These places show us that even in the Middle Stone Age, humans were already painting with symbolic colors, carving ritual objects, dancing to rhythms, burying their loved ones with intention, and seeking contact with forces beyond the physical world. Imagine a small group of early humans gathering at dusk inside a cave 70,000 years ago. The fire flickers on their faces, illuminating red ochre markings on the walls. A healer or shaman begins to chant, others join in a rhythmic clap or drum, entering a trance-like state. Outside, the wind brushes across the savanna, and the stars shine above them, stars that they believed were the eyes of ancestral spirits watching over the living. These scenes are not fantasies, they are reconstructions based on the objects and images our ancestors left behind. Every symbol carved, every bead worn, every burial prepared with care tells the same story. These people believed in something beyond themselves. And this belief, this early spark of spirituality, is what eventually grew into the vast and diverse network of traditions we today call African traditional religion. Unlike many world religions, which begin with a single founder or sacred text, African traditional religion has no single starting point. Its origin is not a moment but a process, a slow and organic unfolding over tens of thousands of years. It began with the way early humans interpreted thunder, wind, fire, and death. It grew through the stories they told around the fire, the rituals they performed for protection, the respect they showed to those who passed away, and the connection they felt to the land that sustained them. Over time, these simple rituals and beliefs evolved into complex systems of ancestor veneration, ceremonies of healing, divine kingship, and communication with the spirit world, all of which still exist today in various forms across the continent. As we explore the archaeological evidence, we begin to see that African spirituality did not suddenly appear. It emerged naturally from the environment, the challenges of survival, and the human desire to understand the unseen. The earliest humans looked at life and death, at storms and droughts, at animals and the stars, and they recognized patterns, powers, and mysteries. They realized that there were forces they could not control but could possibly communicate with. And from this realization came ritual that marks the earliest chapters of human religion. In this video, we embark on a journey through time, tracing the spiritual footsteps of our ancient ancestors. We will look at the 70,000-year-old burials that reveal early beliefs in the afterlife. We will explore sacred caves and rock art that show the first evidence of shamanic rituals. We will study the objects and symbols that mark the earliest forms of religious expression. And above all, we will see how these ancient practices became the foundation of African traditional religion, a living tradition that continues to bridge the human and spiritual worlds to this day. When we understand these origins, we understand something profound. African religion is not primitive, not a relic of the past, but the oldest continuous spiritual system on the planet. It carries within it the first whispers of humanity's search for meaning and our earliest attempts to communicate with what lies beyond. And so, our journey begins here, in the deep caves, the ancient hills, and the sacred landscapes where human spirituality was born. When archaeologists first uncovered the ancient graves scattered across different parts of Africa, they realized they were not simply looking at bones, they were looking at evidence of belief. A burial is never just a practical act of disposing of a body. It is a statement about life, death, and what might come after. And some of the oldest burials in human history are found on African soil, dating back tens of thousands of years, long before any recorded civilization existed. These graves open a window into the minds of early humans, revealing that they were capable of symbolic thought, emotional depth, and a profound sense of the spiritual world. In South Africa, in a region known for some of the most significant archaeological discoveries ever made, researchers found Middle Stone Age graves that date back more than 70,000 years. Inside them were not just human remains, but objects carefully placed alongside the bodies, red ochre, beads carved from shells, pieces of animal bone shaped into tools, and small artifacts that held symbolic meaning. These items were not randomly tossed in. They were chosen, arranged, and buried with intention. The earliest humans believed that the dead would need these objects in another place, another life, a realm beyond the physical world. This tells us something extraordinary. Even at the dawn of humanity, people believed death was not an end but a transition. One of the most striking examples comes from Ethiopia, where the famous Herto skulls were discovered. These remains, dating back around 160,000 years, carry signs of ceremonial handling. The skulls had been carefully shaped and smoothed, as if cleaned and prepared for ritual purposes after death. Such treatment is not accidental, it reflects a deep respect for the deceased and a belief that their presence continues beyond the grave. Modern African communities still perform rituals where skulls or bones of ancestors are honored, consulted, or kept in sacred places. These ancient practices echo across thousands of generations, reminding us that the idea of the ancestors as spiritual guardians has roots that stretch back to prehistory. The repeated use of red ochre in these ancient burials is another powerful symbol. Ochre is a natural pigment, but for early humans it carried rich spiritual meaning. The color red was associated with life, blood, protection, and rebirth. When they painted the bodies of the dead with ochre or sprinkled it around the graves, they were performing an act of spiritual preparation, helping the soul transition safely into the next world. This simple pigment was more than a color, it was an early form of prayer, a protective spell, an expression of hope that the spirit would be guided and watched over. The presence of beads is equally important. In some graves, small shells with carefully drilled holes were found, strung together into necklaces or ornaments. These beads are the earliest known personal decorations in human history, but they were also symbols of identity and status. To place them in a grave meant the deceased carried their connection to the living community into the afterlife. In many African cultures today, beads still play a sacred role. They protect children, identify spiritual healers, mark initiation rites, and are offered to ancestors in rituals. The fact that beads appear in these prehistoric burials shows that symbolic adornment was one of the first expressions of spirituality. Animal bones found in the graves also tell a story. Some appear to have been selected specifically for their meaning: horns, claws, and bones from animals regarded as powerful or protective. Even at this early stage, humans were choosing symbols from nature to guide and safeguard the dead. Modern African traditional religion continues to use animal symbolism, seeing certain animals as messengers, guardians, or carriers of spiritual energy. The prehistoric graves show us that this connection between humanity, nature, and the spiritual world was established long before recorded history. What makes these discoveries even more remarkable is that the graves reveal patterns, repeated behaviors across different regions and across vast stretches of time. This means early humans were not simply reacting instinctively, they were following rituals. Ritual means memory, tradition, something taught and passed down. It suggests that these beliefs were not isolated but shared within groups, forming the earliest foundations of religious culture. Through these ancient burials, we see the first steps toward ancestor veneration, a core pillar of African traditional religion. The careful placement of objects, the use of symbolic materials, and the preparation of bodies show that the dead were not feared but honored. They were seen as part of the community, still present in some form, still connected to the living. This understanding eventually evolved into the belief that ancestors guide, protect, and watch over their descendants, a belief that remains central in African spirituality today. As we examine these graves, we are reminded that the people who lived 70,000 years ago were not primitive beings struggling blindly to survive. They were humans who loved, remembered, and believed. They mourned their dead, celebrated their lives, and prepared them for a journey beyond this world. Their rituals were the seeds of faith, the earliest expressions of a worldview that understood life and death as part of a larger spiritual cycle. These ancient graves are not just archaeological evidence, they are the earliest chapters in the story of religion itself, chapters written by the first humans who dared to imagine that life continues after the body is gone. As we move deeper into the ancient spiritual landscape of Africa, we leave the graves of the early ancestors and step into the sacred spaces where the living gathered to communicate with the unseen. Among all the prehistoric sites scattered across the continent, none is as captivating, mysterious, and spiritually charged as the Tsodilo Hills in Botswana. Rising sharply from the surrounding desert like an island of stone, the hills have been a place of worship and ritual for more than 100,000 years, making them one of the oldest continually sacred locations on Earth. To the indigenous San people, Tsodilo is not just a hill, it is the mountain of the gods, a place where the first human, the first animals, and the first spirits emerged into the world. Even today, many San believe that the hill holds immense power, and that the ancestors still dwell within the rock, listening to those who come seeking guidance. Walking through Tsodilo, one encounters thousands of rock paintings scattered across the sandstone walls, over 4,000 images created across tens of millennia. These paintings are more than art, they are mirrors reflecting the spiritual life of early humans. Some paintings depict hunters with bows and arrows, their bodies elongated and stylized as if they are in motion, pursuing animals that seem to glow with spiritual energy. Other paintings show figures with animal features, humans with antelope heads, dancers with bird wings, shamans with elongated limbs floating or transforming. These hybrid forms are not random. Fantasy, they are the visual language of shamanic trance, where the healer or spiritual guide enters an altered state to communicate with spirits, ancestors, or animal powers. The rock art at Tsodilo is essentially a record of the earliest religious ceremonies performed by humanity. Rock art across Africa repeatedly shows similar themes. At sites in Namibia, Tanzania, South Africa, and beyond. Ancient paintings reveal the same elements: dancers circling around a fire, drummers beating out rhythms, shamans bending forward as they enter trance, and animal figures radiating symbolic power. These consistent images prove that ritual behavior was deeply rooted in the prehistoric consciousness of African communities. The trance dance, for example, is a practice still performed by many San groups today. In this ritual, participants dance in a circle for hours, their breath and heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of drums until the spiritual energy called begins to boil inside the healers. When it reaches a peak, the healer enters trance, collapsing or trembling as they travel to the spirit world to heal the sick, seek knowledge, or speak with the ancestors. What is astonishing is that paintings of this exact ritual appear on rock walls that are thousands of years old, showing continuity between ancient and modern African spirituality. Studying these images forces us to rethink what early humans were capable of. These were people who understood symbolism, movement, rhythm, and emotional expression. They gathered in caves and rocky shelters not simply for protection from weather, but because these places carried acoustic resonance, darkness, and a sense of enclosure that strengthened the spiritual experience. Archaeologists have noted that many rock art sites show evidence of repeated use: fires built in the same locations, pigments prepared in the same corners, and tools left behind by generations of ritual practitioners. These were not casual visits, they were ceremonial gatherings, communal events where knowledge was passed down and the bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds was reinforced. Tsodilo Hills offers more than paintings. There are rocks that ring like bells when struck, natural stone instruments used in ceremonies. There are small depressions carved into rock surfaces where offerings may have been placed. Some areas are arranged in ways that resemble altars or gathering circles. Every part of the landscape seems to have held meaning. The hills themselves are named symbolically: the male hill, the female hill, and the child hill, forming a spiritual family whose presence shapes the rituals performed there. According to San mythology, the male hill was the first to exist, and it was where the Creator sat when he made the world. Even the placement of water sources around the hills aligns with ancient stories of creation, reinforcing the site's status as a cosmic center. These sacred places reveal a crucial truth about the origins of African traditional religion: it was never confined to a single temple or sacred text. Instead, religion was rooted in the land itself. Caves, mountains, rivers, and deserts were not empty spaces, they were spiritual beings, guardians, and teachers. The environment was alive, and humans moved through it with reverence. Every ritual performed in these places was an act of communication with the spirits who lived within the earth, the sky, and the animals. This worldview, born 100,000 years ago, continues to shape the spiritual practices of many African communities today. The continuity is remarkable. The trance dances depicted on rock walls still take place in villages across southern Africa. The belief that spirits inhabit specific mountains or rivers remains central in many African traditions. The use of dance, chanting, and symbolic imagery to enter spiritual states is still at the heart of rituals performed by diviners, healers, and mediums. Far from being relics of the past, these ancient practices are threads weaving together the earliest spiritual expressions of humanity with the modern rituals of African traditional religion. As we stand before the rock paintings of Tsodilo Hills or any ancient sacred site in Africa, we are not just observing history. We are witnessing the earliest footsteps of human spirituality. We are seeing a record of the first shamans, the first ceremonies, the first symbolic expressions of belief. These paintings, crafted with care and intention, are the voices of our ancestors echoing across time, inviting us to remember that the spiritual journey of humanity began long before cities, scriptures, or prophets. It began in the movement of dancers, the beating of drums, the glow of fire upon stone, and the deep yearning to connect with forces unseen. As we explore the earliest traces of African spirituality, one theme becomes unmistakably clear. The first humans were not only creating rituals, they were creating symbols. Objects carried meaning far beyond their physical form, and these meanings became the language through which early humans communicated with the spirit world. Among the most powerful symbols uncovered in prehistoric African sites is red ochre, a simple mineral pigment that appears again and again in caves, graves, and ritual spaces dating back more than 75,000 years. In Blombo's cave, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre etched with geometric patterns, carefully engraved lines that suggest intentional symbolism. These markings represent some of the oldest known art in human history, but they are also among the oldest signs of ritual thinking. To early humans, ochre was not merely a color, it was life itself. Its deep red hues were linked to blood, vitality, fertility, and the life force that animates all living beings. When they painted their bodies with ochre or used it in burial ceremonies, they were invoking protection, renewal, and spiritual power. The use of ochre reveals a sophisticated symbolic system that predates writing by tens of thousands of years. Early humans learned to grind it, mix it with fat or water, and apply it to bodies, skins, or cave walls. They used it in ceremonies, carried it in small containers, and treated it with reverence. This ritual use of pigment is echoed in many African traditions today, where red still symbolizes strength, ancestral connection, and sacred power. The ancient relationship between color and meaning shows how deeply African spirituality is rooted in the land, its minerals, its earth, its natural pigments. It is a reminder that the earliest rituals were acts of painting not just on stone but on the human soul. Alongside ochre, beads offer another window into the symbolic world of Africa's earliest spiritual practitioners. Some of the oldest beads ever found, made from seashells, ostrich eggshells, and even animal bones, come from African sites as old as 75,000 years. These beads were not crafted for simple decoration, they were worn, carried, and buried with the dead as markers of identity, status, or spiritual significance. Each bead required time and skill, drilling a hole through hard shell, smoothing the edges, threading them together. These were deliberate acts of creation. To wear a bead was to declare something about oneself, membership in a group, a role within a ritual, a connection to the ancestors. In many African cultures today, beads still hold special meaning. They protect infants, empower healers, signify kingship, and appear in countless ceremonies from birth to death. The continuity of bead symbolism shows how the earliest expressions of identity and spirituality evolved into the rich traditions we see now. Carvings found at prehistoric sites also show early humans developing a symbolic language through art. Small figurines made from bone, stone, or ivory hint at representations of deities, ancestors, or spirit animals. Some carvings are abstract. Others depict animals with exaggerated features, large horns, elongated bodies, or expressive faces, suggesting they held symbolic power. These carvings were not toys or tools. They were objects of meaning, perhaps used in ceremonies or kept as sacred items that connected the living with the world of spirits. Their forms reflect the same themes found in later African religious practices. Reverence for nature, belief in animal guardians, and the idea that spiritual power can be held in physical objects. The crafting of these objects required not only skill but intention. Early humans did not carve without purpose, they carved because they believed these objects could influence the unseen world. A carved stone could protect a family. A shell bead could link the living with the dead. A piece of ochre could carry prayers across the boundary between worlds. These beliefs laid the foundation for what would eventually become altars, shrines, charms, amulets, and sacred regalia in African traditional religion. Even today, many African spiritual leaders keep carved figures representing ancestral spirits, nature deities, or protective forces. These modern objects echo the same prehistoric instinct, to hold the sacred in one's hands, to make the invisible visible. The power of symbolism is not just in the objects themselves, but in the rituals that grew around them. In prehistoric Africa, rituals were communal acts that brought people together in moments of transition, healing, or celebration. When the community gathered to paint themselves with ochre, they were preparing for something sacred. When beads were placed in a grave, the people were performing a final act of love and protection. When a carving was held above a fire or placed in a cave shrine, it symbolized communication with a world beyond ordinary sight. These actions were the earliest forms of ceremony, the roots of religious practices that would later flourish across the continent. The symbolism embedded in these objects reveals something profound about the minds of early humans. They understood that the world was layered, material and spiritual, visible and invisible, physical and metaphysical. They believed that objects could hold power, carry memory, and connect them to forces beyond their control. This worldview would eventually evolve into the elaborate systems of divination, initiation, ancestor worship, and healing rituals that define African traditional religion today. The beads worn by modern healers, the sacred colors used in ceremonies, the carved figures placed in shrines, all of these are the descendants of prehistoric symbols created by our earliest ancestors. When we look at a piece of ochre etched with ancient lines, or a shell bead worn by someone who lived 70,000 years ago, or a small figurine carved from bone, we are not simply studying artifacts. We are witnessing the first sparks of spiritual consciousness. These objects represent humanity's earliest attempts to understand and influence the forces of the universe. They are the physical evidence of belief, the first tools of faith, crafted long before words, stories, or scriptures. And through them, we can trace an unbroken lineage from the dawn of human thought to the living traditions of Africa today. Across the vast span of human history, the traces left behind by early Africans do more than tell us where our ancestors lived, they tell us how they understood existence itself. When we gather all the evidence together, from the carefully arranged burials and sacred ochre pigments to the rock paintings and ritual artifacts scattered across ancient landscapes, a clear picture begins to form. These early people were not simply surviving, they were seeking meaning, connection, and protection in a world that often seemed unpredictable and mysterious. The graves from 70,000 years ago show us that even in the earliest chapters of humanity, death was not regarded as an ending. It was a passage, a transformation, a merging with something unseen yet deeply respected. Those who buried their dead with ochre, beads, and tools were not acting randomly, they believed the soul continued elsewhere, and that the living had a responsibility to honor this transition. Over time, these early gestures of respect toward the departed evolved into the foundations of ancestor veneration, one of the central pillars of African traditional religion today. The sacred sites, like the Tsodilo Hills, the ancient mountains covered with stories painted on stone, reveal the emergence of places where the physical and spiritual worlds met. These spaces, imbued with quiet power, served as communal gateways to the unseen. Ritual dances, trance journeys, and communication with spirits did not emerge suddenly. They grew from the earliest practices of shamans who believed that humans could step across the invisible boundary and return with knowledge or healing. Even the symbols found etched into bone and stone, from spirals to animal figures, became seeds of the rich spiritual symbolism that later defined African religious traditions. And the ochre, that living, blood-like pigment used for tens of thousands of years, continued its journey through time, finding its place in ceremonies, initiations, healings, and sacred objects across the continent. When we reflect on this deep continuity, it becomes increasingly clear that African traditional religion is not a belief system that suddenly appeared with kingdoms or empires. It is the continuation of the world's oldest spiritual conversation, one that began when humanity first opened its eyes to the mysteries of life, death, and the unseen. These early rituals, shaped by survival, awe, and wonder, matured over millennia into complex systems of worship involving ancestors, nature spirits, divination, and ceremonial practices that remain alive in African communities today. This uninterrupted chain of belief challenges the idea that religion requires temples or scriptures to be meaningful. Instead, it shows that the earliest spiritual truths were lived, danced, painted, sung, and passed from generation to generation through experience and ritual. In the end, the origins of African religion are not simply archaeological facts, they are reminders of humanity's oldest longing. When we stand before a 70,000-year-old grave, run our hands along the walls of a cave painted by ancient hands, or imagine the rhythmic heartbeat of a long-ago ritual drum echoing through the night, we are witnessing the earliest attempts to understand our place in the universe. And while countless civilizations have risen and fallen, these spiritual roots have endured. They have adapted, grown, and flourished, carrying forward the voices of ancestors who believed that the world was alive with meaning, that every stone and river held a story, and that the living and the dead remained forever connected. This is the true legacy of Africa's ancient spirituality, an unbroken thread stretching from the first humans to the present day, reminding us that long before there was history, there was belief.